بسم الله على بركة الله نبدأ.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Good evening, everybody. This is a great opportunity to have this forum regarding the business family. And what a better day to have this topic than the day of the mother, Mother's Day, when mother considered to be the most important member of the family. And we are discussing the family business, the turnaround and restructuring of the family business, talking about the stress and distress of the family business. We are talking about second and third generations. It's a very, very important topic that will be highlighted and introduced by a very important team, which will be head by Mr. Paul Gilbert, which I will leave the ground for him to introduce himself and his team.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Sophia, if we go to the introductory slide, and I'd like to thank, before I start, I'd like to thank Majid Guru for this opportunity. Really appreciate it. So without further ado, let me introduce myself, and then I'll pass on briefly to each of the team to introduce themselves. My name is Paul Gilbert. I'm a managing director with Alvarez & Marsal, and I lead the turnaround and restructuring team of Alvarez & Marsal in the Middle East. I'm an accountant by training, but I've worked in turnaround, interim management, resolving underperformance throughout the whole of my career, virtually since I qualified. And I've worked on all types of situations, from those underperforming cases through to, so underperforming and not yet cash distress, let's say, through to, insolvent, where there's pretty much no cash left at all. So I've worked across the whole spectrum that we'll describe in a minute. And at A&M, I work mostly with companies and their boards to help them fix their problems, ideally avoid them getting into trouble before it's too late, or if they're in trouble, helping them get out of trouble and saving the business and the jobs that go with it. I've worked in many different sectors and jurisdictions. I've been in the Middle East now for nearly 2 years, and most recently, during most of that time, I've been working on the restructuring of NMC Healthcare, which is probably the largest restructuring in the world over that period. And fingers crossed, we expect to have the restructuring of that completed under a 2-year period, which is a first for this region. And we're very proud of the fact that we've been in and out and solved what is a very complex situation in such a short period of time. And while I've been working on many aspects of the restructuring, I've actually been undertaking the interim CFO role on that case for that period. That's me. Enough about me, and let me now hand over to, and I'll go around the screen in clockwise order. I'll hand over to Guy Wall. Guy.
Thank you, Paul. Tough person to follow when it comes to CV and background, but I'll do my best. So my name's Guy Wall, Managing Director at Alvarez & Marsal as well. My focus is solely on the far end of that stressed, distressed and insolvent side. So my key role is effectively when businesses may or may not have reached the end of their profitability or their demise curve. And historically, it's been outright insolvency appointments. So those style of bankruptcy trustee roles. I'm a registered liquidator in the DIFC and ADGM, which is in the UAE. Been in the region for 7 years now, and had appointments ranging from running the Royal Bank of Scotland through to national, regional and sort of some global businesses that have required insolvency appointments, and individuals to try to manage those really complex stressed and distressed situations. Sometimes that may run through to a standard wind down, through to managing a trading business, or the actual outcome of trying to recover assets that may have been inappropriately manoeuvred away from the reach of accessible creditors. But looking forward to speaking with everyone today and giving a light insight into the insolvency world. And I'll hand over to Cam now to talk through his introduction.
Thank you, Guy, and good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I'll keep my introduction brief. I too am a chartered accountant by training. I have about 22 years experience, of which it's been spread quite evenly between the UK, Australia, Asia, with most recently about 8 years in the Middle East. I guess I describe myself as more of a situational person. So across a range of sectors, I've got experience working in complex, challenging businesses, more so in my recent years in sort of more turnaround and transformation situations. And something I'm really passionate about, especially so in the Middle East, is helping business owners and stakeholders and businesses reframe in their minds what a transformation or a turnaround or a restructuring actually means and is, and turning it from a bit of what I think is a bit of a negative in the region into something that can be seen as a positive. So if management and their stakeholders are seen to be taking positive action in relation to businesses that are underperforming or struggling and in distress, that can be a good thing. And that's something that I think it would be really benefit the Saudi and the Middle East as a whole. So it's something I'm quite passionate about and looking forward to talking to you a little bit more about that this evening. And with that, I'll hand over to Sophia. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much for having us today. We're very happy to be here and to speak to you all. My name is Sophia Sarah Addas. I am a Saudi national and part of the turnaround and restructuring team in the Middle East. I'm based between Riyadh and Jeddah. I have 10 years of experience in corporate finance, restructuring, insolvency across the Middle East, so Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and also the UK and the Americas. And currently, I am working on turnarounds and transformations of Saudi companies. Thank you very much.
Okay, so that's us. And let me now give you a brief introduction to Alvarez and Marcel. I won't spend too long on this before we get into the meat of what we want to talk about. So A&M was founded in 1983 by Brian Marcel and Tony Alvarez in New York. They're both still, by the way, very much involved in the business. And the firm's heritage is in restructuring, but as you can see from this slide, we do so much more than that, and we cover, we have expertise in depth in a lot of industry sectors, but also we've added a whole number of additional service lines to the offering, as you can see on the slide there. Our focus is on execution, fixing problems or delivering on a plan, not just writing thick reports. And hence, that's why we describe the restructuring heritage with a real operational edge that is what we're all about. We do not do audit, so that's worth pointing out. So we don't have the conflicts that obviously many of the audit firms do. And in terms of staffing, you can see that we're close to 6,000 professionals. And we're well over 1,000 now in Europe, Middle East, Africa, and in fact, I think if you take into account the latest growth spurt, I think we're actually closer to 1,800 in EMEA. And in the Middle East specifically, we're growing fast. We have approximately 100 in the Middle East now of headcount, and we have plans to triple that in 3 to 4 years' time. So, on the back of the opportunities and the way in which the market is moving in both Saudi Arabia and more generally, we're very keen to work further with businesses that need additional support, where we really think that we can help and make a difference. Let's move to the next slide, please, Sophia. Right, so this slide really just sets out the 4 areas that we're going to briefly talk about, and you might argue that we've invented one, but I'll explain that in a moment. And I'm going to really talk from right to left and just very briefly explain what we mean by each of those categories. Insolvent, it sounds obvious, and maybe it is to some, but for those who it's not necessarily straightforward to, it's either run out of cash, so zero liquidity, doesn't know how it's going to pay for its next supplies or to pay its wages, whatever it is. So we describe that as cash flow insolvent, or actually it's insolvent on a balance sheet basis, by which we mean that the assets are greater than the liabilities. And I think businesses in the insolvent end, then they can either be in a formal process, or they're about to be in a formal process, or maybe they should be in a formal process. And by a formal process, we mean some kind of bankruptcy regime whereby there is a moratorium that is placed on further actions against the company by the creditors, and Guy will come on to talk about that a little later. Moving on to the left, distressed businesses. So they haven't completely exhausted their cash flow, but they're really struggling to pay their short-term obligations. It's very much a hand-to-mouth existence, and they're probably trading with the support of some key creditors, and they're probably getting a lot of reaction from other creditors who have not been paid for a long time, and that's causing a risk. It's a difficult area to be in, because you're now fighting fires and not necessarily in full control of what's going to happen next. So we tend to try to avoid the distressed arena. This will be a theme that you'll hear, that the earlier we can get in to help restructure businesses, the better. Distressed area is not a pleasant area to be, but you certainly need help and advice if you're in the distressed arena. Moving further to the left, stressed is really where profits are declining, or profits have taken a hit for whatever reason, and it can be a sudden hit, or it can be something that's steadily, just been happening over a period of time. And you can see cash starting to decline, but at this stage, you're managing your cash resources really quite well. But management needs to start taking action, or risk becoming distressed and losing control of the agenda. And what's really important in this stage is conserving liquidity to enable you to get through that period of stress, and to actually come out of the other side and avoid getting into the distressed arena. So it's too easy to become overconfident in this period and be too slow taking action, in which case you run out of time and cash. And pre-stress, I think what we'll do is we'll just flip to the next page, because I think it starts to bring alive what I mean by pre-stress. And what I'm doing here is comparing not just the Middle East, but there are a number of other territories where this is what we call the Demise Curve. And in brief, let's just describe that. At the start of this graph from the left to right shows a business from its early days, really generating profits and value. And you can see on that, the y-axis on the left, it's financial health. It's generating cash, it's producing profits, and life is good, and shareholders have got value, and creditors are happy they're being paid. And many businesses then move into a period of decline, where either their markets have disappeared or changed, or something's happened, and the management and the board need to take action. And you can see that as the blue line has a steady decline in most markets, you'll see it move from stress through distressed and then to insolvent, depending on how serious it is, how fast it's happened, etc. The reason for the purple line, that is in some markets, and I include the Middle East in this, there is in the pre-stress period a false sense of security sometimes, by virtue of the fact that that cash can tend to be drip fed by either a benign shareholder or a bank, drip feeding cash long after they probably should have stopped. And you know, for that bank or that shareholder, you know, they're starting to get themselves into difficulty and become more exposed as the business declines and action isn't being taken. And what's happening there as well is that there's no incentive for the board or management to make the necessary changes. And so it's, you know, the cash drip feed is really allowing a business to continue without really the pressure to make a change. And as Cam said earlier, you know, it's restructuring shouldn't be seen as a negative. It should be done before you really need to. So I've mentioned cash, and then the second one we described there are insolvency triggers. There are a number of territories where insolvency triggers are either difficult to pull, or indeed creditors don't particularly want to pull the insolvency trigger. So it doesn't happen as early as it would in some other territories, and it does depend upon, you know, the legal background. I know that there's a huge amount of progress been made in the kingdom, and again, Guy's going to come on to that later. So on that demise curve, you know, a company can be really in a stressed situation without actually realizing it, because of a cash drip feed or because there's not been any triggers, and they don't take action. So what's happening there, and this is really important to emphasize, is that value is being destroyed over a much longer period of time if the creditors or if the management rather is not taking the actions that they need to take. And you know, we have an expression that, forgive me for using it, but it's the expression of saying that you really need to fix the roof while the sun is shining. And it just allows, the point is that you have far more options available, more time available in order to take the necessary actions and avoid going further down that decline curve and actually coming out of it earlier. So yeah, pre-stress is it's a phase that we see in so many businesses in this region, and as I say, not just this region. But if I compare it with, say, the UK and the USA, definitely there's a longer stretch before, in many cases, businesses start to take the action that they need to take. And as I say, it destroys value over a longer period, and it means that your options become more limited, because maybe you've used up the cash that either your facilities that are available under your bank lending or through a benign shareholder. Maybe you've used that cash up, you know, when you should have actually, you know, to just survive and fight fires, whereas you should have been using it to really make a difference and start the upward curve again. Quickly, therefore, to the next slide, and I won't dwell too much on this slide, because I think pre-stress, although we've described it here as, you know, pre-stress, it's the early stage before you get into real stress, and so you're seeing lower profit margins, you know, minor operational constraints, you know, your market shares decreasing, etc. That's definitely a pre-stress period when you should be looking at the early warning signs and what have you. But I think it's also important for me to emphasize yet again that in this environment, and I would say actually particularly with family businesses where maybe there is a you know, a wealth that's been built up over many years, there is desire to not take radical action and to actually drip feed that cash in, when actually in reality, although we call it pre-stress and lower profits, margins, minor operational constraints, actually the reality is that the underlying business is stressed and would be distressed if it weren't for that drip feed and insolvency and drip feed and you know, lack of insolvency triggers as a result of either the drip feed or just the environment or the family, you know, family wealth drip feeding cash in. And as I say, the longer that carries on, the more wealth either by the lenders or the shareholder, the family wealth is being diminished more and more, and you're losing the ability to really take the action that should happen. So again, it's about saying that restructuring is not a bad thing. The sooner you take that action, the better, and it should be seen as really value accretive rather than kind of something negative or to be ashamed of. The best businesses reinvent themselves and restructure time and time again. And I think for the next slide, I'm handing over, I believe, to Sophia.
Correct, that's right. Thank you, Paul. Right, so this takes us to stress. And what it basically means, as Paul mentioned, is at this point, your profits are significantly lower than prior years. And your cash is starting to decline, but it's not yet positive. It's not yet negative. So you're still not in distressed territory, but you can already see a loss in your market share, deteriorating performance as well. And what you should be worried about when you're stressed is, of course, accelerating performance deterioration, right? Because you don't want to go from stressed to distressed. And other things that you should be worried about when you're stressed is the loss of stakeholder support. So, for example, your creditors, your key suppliers, your employees. Are they noticing that you're losing market share? Are they noticing that your profitability is declining? As well as management focus and capabilities. Because is management identifying that there is a problem when the company is stressed? And are they able to identify the problem, to know there's a problem, but also to know what the problem is? And this is a very important point, because at this point, you can really have a shift in management focus from focusing on day-to-day operations to starting to identifying the problem. And kind of we start to have a little bit of a shift in focus. So now we go to what can you do about it when a company is stressed? So there are three things that we have on the slide. We have a performance diagnostic, which is basically building a robust fact base. So really, it's almost like having a company doctor, right? That comes in and does a checkup to the company, identifies what is the root cause of decline, what exactly is happening in the company, why is your cash decreasing, and why are you losing market share? And then we go on to developing a transformation or turnaround plan. So once we've had the checkup, once we understand what is going on, what is the diagnostic, then we're able to come up with initiatives to help the company get out of stress into profitability. And then, of course, the most important part is executing that plan and implementing that plan. And this is exactly what we're talking about when we say it's not just the reports that we write, but we're actually implementing the plan to get the company back into profitability.
I think, Sophia, if I might add something that you'll find with a stressed business versus those that are further down the decline curve is around time. You have more time, you have more cash, you have more options, you typically have more stakeholder support, and you have more control. So if stakeholders in businesses that are starting to experience and notice a decline in their cash, or a loss of their market share, or margins eroding, or their overhead base gradually creeping up, this is the ideal time to actually take a step back and really get under the skin of the business and understand what the issues are. A recent experience that we've had with a stressed business was a business that just simply put together tractors, of all things. Very simple business in terms of components and development, putting together tractors. This business was part of a large family organization and had for years had no investment in it. And no one had really taken notice of the gradual decline in the market share, in the decline of the performance, the margins and the performance of the business. And our piece of work, what we did is literally just did the performance diagnostic. And we went in, and what we did is we ensured that the stakeholders who are associated with the business, and in this case predominantly the shareholders, had a really strong understanding of where the business had sort of got off track, what had gone wrong, but also more importantly, where it could be fixed, and how to fix it. So this was a really interesting project, and just this one. In this one case, we identified a very clear inflection point where the number of units dropped. Once we identified that point, we were able to keep following that thread and identify why, and then build plans about how to get that business back to where it should be. So this is coming back to what I mentioned earlier about this paradigm shift, especially in the kingdom, around taking this sort of action earlier, because we got into this particular business sooner. We weren't having to necessarily firefight all of the challenges, which we'll talk about on the next slide, which are around liquidity and cash and pressure from shareholders and diminishing options. So with that, I'll hand back to Sophia and we can move to the next slide.
Thank you, Cam. All right, so the next slide, we talk about distress. So at this point, you're really struggling to pay your short-term obligations. You have accumulated losses, so your losses have accumulated over the years. You are basically losing stakeholder confidence, right? You're having to constantly reassure your stakeholders, whether that's your bank or your investors, and you're also breaching covenants. So this is a very important one. When a company is distressed, they're breaching their covenants, whether it's their debt to EBITDA ratio or the debt to asset ratio, and they're having severe liquidity pressures, right? Maybe they're unable to pay salaries. So what you should be worried about, of course, you should be worried about insolvency. You should be worried about bankruptcy, خوف من الإفلاس, basically. You should also be worried about the personal guarantees that the shareholders have pledged against the business, right? Whether it's collaterals or guarantees, as well as directors' duties, right? Because at this point, are the directors taking the right actions to take the company out of distress and into profitability? How are they handling the cash? How are they handling the operations? What can you do about it? When a company is in distress, we spoke about options assessment. So here you are evaluating your options. What can you do about it? How can you repay your debt? How can you improve your operations? How can you improve your cash flow? Here we speak about a rapid turnaround plan. Rather than just a transformation plan, this is a very quick turnaround plan. So we do these sometimes in 6 weeks, 8 weeks, where it's a very quick turnaround plan, where we go in, we do the diagnostics, and we come up with a plan to turn the business around.
Actually, Sophia, the last one we did was in 3 weeks. So,
right.
The word rapid really plays to in these sorts of situations. You have to be very pragmatic. You cannot be particularly precise, and you need to move quite quickly. I describe this as a sledgehammer rather than a scalpel. So this is really getting in and finding those 4 or 5 key things that need to be done to stabilize the business and give it more time, more cash, more options for a more progressive turnaround.
But let me add, it's the sort of situation where an imperfect decision is far, far better than no decision at all.
That's right. And actually, one of the projects that we worked on recently, the company wasn't able to pay their salaries in the next month. So we had to come up with something very quickly. How are you going to pay your employees? How are you going to deliver on your projects? Achieve your milestones so that you can start getting cash. So yeah, I completely agree. Very rapid. And then another point is cash and crisis management. So here, one of the projects, for example, that we've done is we've created a cash office. Right, so a cash office is basically, it's a way that the business handles cash that is very different to how you handle cash in day-to-day operations, right? You're paying your suppliers differently, you're negotiating your supplier terms, and the crisis part of it is stakeholder management, right? So we're helping the company speak to the bankers, negotiate, come up to a solution that is viable for all parties. And then the last part is interim management, which is actually is why I joined A&M. I joined A&M because I really like the fact that they do interim management. So in a lot of situations, we would have one of our own go into the company and act as the company CFO. And this is very different to a day-to-day CFO, right? Because you're performing under pressure. It's crisis management, it's cash management. It's a very, very complex situation, I would say. Paul, you've done a lot of these interim management, you and Cam. I don't know if you want to add a little bit more color around it.
No, like I think, I think it is one of the differences with our approach, and it is that we're prepared to sit and work alongside the management to really help them through the difficult times. And honestly, not many firms have the risk appetite to do that, nor do they have the background of experience in doing it. So, for instance, I've actually sat on the board of a distressed business in South Africa, which was way outside of our zone of knowledge at the time we did it. But we became comfortable with the jurisdiction. We became comfortable with the board that they were going to do the right things. And we really helped them through a very complex restructuring and kept that business alive. So as Sophia says, the interim roles can be very helpful. And I look at it this way. Oftentimes you get into a situation where we know that the management is very good. They know their business inside out. They know how to make, for instance, in Cam's situation, they know how to make tractors. But what they don't know how to do is manage a business that's suffering from shortage of cash, the lenders knocking on their door, creditors, knocking on the door, etc. And that's a skill set that we bring, so we can work alongside. Now, it doesn't have to be interim support, but it can often be helpful. But either way, we'll work. We work alongside the management teams to help them through those troubles.
Wonderful, thank you, Paul. And if the company doesn't take action when it's distressed, unfortunately, it goes into insolvency. So I will hand over to Guy for the insolvent part.
Insolvency is unique, isn't it? So when we say insolvent here, we're effectively talking about bankruptcy for the kingdom. We're talking about that time in the business's life cycle when it's really unable to pay its debts as and when they fall due. And what's quite peculiar about insolvency is that every single one of the points that we've been hearing about so far in the what you are experiencing of eroding margins, of reduced profits generally, of a position where the business is not at its absolute best, all can be characterised potentially under the insolvent banner. And what I mean by that is that, like Paul mentioned with the Demise Curve, it's a different sort of region that we operate in here, where a business can continue in a state of sort of flux or non-profitability for a very long amount of time, to the point of where the business owners or stakeholders may simply become used to the level of profitability that they experience. They may become used to the fact that they're not always able to pay their bills, and they simply think that it is still the status quo and we continue with our business operations as usual. But what's quite unique here is that oftentimes that's really not the case. And what you have is a business that in some respects can be balance sheet insolvent or cash flow insolvent. And before I sort of go through and talk about sort of the basics of what you're experiencing and what you need to be worried about, I think it's good to have a little education component about what is balance sheet insolvency and what is cash flow insolvency. So you may be sitting there, an advisor to a business, a manager yourself, or even an owner, and you'll look at your profit and loss, and you'll sit there and say, well, we don't make great money. We've actually been losing money for the last period of time. But when I look at my balance sheet, it appears healthy, so everything is okay. Now, that two distinctions between the profit and loss and the balance sheet is really where we work out cash flow insolvent or balance sheet insolvent. So cash flow insolvent in effect is being unable to pay your debts as and when they fall due. You can be cash flow insolvent while still actually having a rather healthy looking balance sheet. And you may think, well, that's not really possible because I can just sell my assets, Guy, and I'm not going to have any problems. But one thing that sort of surprises a lot of owners or managers is that the accounting of their balance sheet may not truly reflect the realisable value of their assets, or those assets may actually be pledged as part of loan agreements, security documentation, loans, whatever it may be. So cash flow insolvent is the simple test of not being able to pay your debts as and when they fall due. Balance sheet insolvent then is you may be experiencing some levels of profitability even, but when you look at your balance sheet, there is simply not enough assets to sell to pay out all of the liabilities that your company may have. Now, when we go through these and we look at these types of businesses that may be experiencing various levels of stress, distressed and insolvent, we look through to see what some of the key markers are to work out where that factor is. Those two tests are one of the primary ones, and those are the primary ones that really directors then have to understand about whether they should be taking next steps. But because a business can be balance sheet solvent but cash flow insolvent, or the other way around, there's a few other indicators that we start to really be able to see. And the number one that usually is coming through is the claims that are being raised against the company. They might be something as simple as a letter of demand being issued by a creditor, or they may be all the way through to an actual bankruptcy proceeding being commenced against you for an outstanding debt. Now, creditor amounts can vary. It can be a small claim that the company's been dealing with for years and it's not a problem. That doesn't mean you are insolvent just because you've been dealing with a disputed debt. What it means when you're insolvent is that if we were to draw a line in the sand today and we had to pay every debt that is not challenged or even is challenged, would we be able to do it? Would we have sufficient assets in our balance sheet that we could sell if we were going to place this company into bankruptcy or some sort of liquidation procedures? And that is that inability to pay the debts. Other points you might notice during this time of whether we're insolvent or not is what's happening with the lenders. What's your bank doing? What are the people that have provided you a line of credit currently entering into dialogue with you about? So what often happens is that you may see that you no longer have the same relationship manager. That relationship manager has changed, and all of a sudden it's a new individual who seems a little bit more aggressive and is asking slightly different questions. And what happens when we get these sort of breaches of covenants that have been mentioned earlier is that file, your loan, or your client's loan, we could say, can sometimes be moved through to the remedial banking department, or bad bank. Now, their focus is very different to what your previous relationship manager may have been talking to you about, where the conversation historically could have been, are we looking on track for the next payment or whenever it may be due? That conversation can start changing to, we need to know the current amount of assets that you are holding. We're notifying that you are breaching your covenants. We will be taking steps to enforce against you. These types of conversations and changes in dialogue are really important to notice and then reach out. If you haven't already reached out in the pre-stress, stressed and distressed phase, you really need to be aware of what's happening during this point in your business. Because like Paul said, when we're trying to fix a roof and it's raining, it doesn't work so well. And what we want to try to do is then get advisors in to be able to help support that dialogue that may be occurring with your bank at that point in time. So highlighting quickly on what we're experiencing at this insolvent level: inability to pay your debts as and when they fall due, potentially balance sheet insolvent, potentially cash flow insolvent, heightened claims occurring, claims moving from simple letters of demand through to actual court dates, labour cases filed against you, that general inability to pay your debts. And of course, the most worrying one, no matter where you are in the world, is that breach of covenants and banks starting to really knock on the door. So if we have that and we look at it, we say, well, I don't think this is very different to what it was before when we say the business might have been stressed or distressed. We say, why do I need to be more worried now? What do I need to be worried about? And this is where key provisions in insolvency law or bankruptcy law start to become very important, because the decisions that you are making now, whilst the business may be characterised as insolvent by the courts or a bankruptcy trustee, will dictate what the future path of the company may have, and as a director, what that outcome could be during some sort of a bankruptcy proceedings. So the first point that we've got mentioned up on the screen here is insolvent trading. Insolvent trading is actually as simple as it sounds, which is that you are continuing to trade the business whilst the company is unable to pay its debts as and when they fall due. Now, why that's critical is that if you are then effectively trading the business whilst insolvent, you as a director have not been taking the appropriate steps to mitigate that loss or have put in an appropriate remediation plan to solve that. In a lot of cases, that may be calling for a meeting of the directors, going to the shareholders and saying, gentlemen and ladies, we have two options on our table. It's one, place the company into bankruptcy, or two, inject further funding into this business. Insolvent trading then is something that we're always quite wary of as directors to make sure that we're doing the best for that business, and most importantly, the creditors that will be impacted in the event of an insolvent event or a bankruptcy process that's going to sit there. So you may sit there and look at it and then say, well, guy, okay, that's fine. I'm making sure that I'm doing the best I can. The business has always been somewhat insolvent, so it's difficult to draw that line in the sand. I make sure I pay the loudest that are screaming, and that keeps our business running. In most cases, you may think that's the correct path, but that is what we identify as a preferential payment. So if we're getting close to a bankruptcy process and you are sitting there and you have one creditor that makes the most amount of noise and say, I'm just going to pay him because it means I can keep my business running. Or if you sit there and you say, well, I've got my friends over here and I want to make sure they don't sort of get burnt during any process that may occur, I'm just going to pay them. What these are preferential payments to individual creditors. And these are not something that is allowable under any bankruptcy regime. The reason they're not allowable is because what you are doing is you are placing one class of creditor, one individual within a class of creditor, above others and above the ordinary order of distribution that needs to occur. So what that order is usually we would see a priority of payments, a waterfall, if you will, of what gets paid and to who. So we'd have our secured creditors, we'd have our employees, we'd have our unsecured creditors, and we'd have our shareholders potentially of what's sitting there. If we're taking out individual positions to pay certain people, we're creating a preference to them. And that is something that is often recoverable within a bankruptcy process. And what that can then mean is to more difficulties for not just the director, but the individuals or companies you paid that to, because that is effectively not looking after the best interest of the company, which in a result is not looking after all of its creditors that are sitting there. And what we have here then, these are all effectively duties of the director to ensure that we have no wrongful trading. We are managing the business to the best of their ability of what they can at the time. We're calling an appropriate shareholders meeting when, as a director, we believe there is not sufficient retained earnings or capital to meet those losses that are coming through. And these are all very important parts of that business to be mindful of. We need to advise any clients that may be sitting there trading an insolvent business to say, hey, you just need to be careful about what you are doing during this time. If we believe this company is in fact bankrupt and we're not taking the appropriate steps to be able to either place it into a process or obtain further funding, we need to ensure that the actions we're taking are in the best interest of all creditors or ensuring in the standard process you would normally see in the event of insolvency or bankruptcy. So we sit there now and we've talked through what we really need to be worried about. But then what is it that you can even do about it? You may sit there and say, you know, when I first came to the region, if a company was bankrupt, it meant there was no assets, there was just a bunch of debt and it was finished. And what we've seen change over the years, specifically in the Kingdom, is that there's been the advent of, I would say, the best new insolvency law put in globally within the past 5 years. The reason I say that is because there is an adequate body in place, there are suitable regulations, there are excellent practitioners operating within the Kingdom that are giving insolvent or bankrupt companies solutions. And now when we say solutions, we're not just talking about, well, I need to just account for the creditors, sell the assets and be done with it. No, what we're talking about is being able to put together plans or situations that can see businesses come out of bankruptcy, move from this point where we're at now, where they may appear entirely insolvent, and give them a new life. And what we talk about when we say we're going to give them a new life or be able to restructure those businesses is like what Paul mentioned previously, is that these proceedings, there's an ability to be able to get a moratorium on our claims. I know in this conversation where we're talking about everyone here today, is that we've probably got a number of lawyers or individuals that may already know what a moratorium is, or this sort of stay on proceedings. But for those that aren't aware of it, when we enter into a bankruptcy process, there is an ability to ensure that no future claims against the company can be filed whilst it is in this bankruptcy process. Why that's important is that stay on proceedings then removes that immediate burden of trying to deal with 70, 100, in some cases I've seen even thousands of lawsuits being filed against the company, and allow the company with its advisors to focus on being able to get it out of this difficult situation, move it from insolvent through to a business that can trade and pay out its creditors. You may say, "God, how is that? It's not even possible. If there's no assets there or there's no liabilities, there's nothing we can do." It's not the case. There is an ability through the existing bankruptcy law that is there to be able to put together restructuring proposals and composition arrangements which involve a certain way and process in which the business will be trading that allows a cent on the dollar style distribution to its creditors. And what that then can mean is that you can go from our business is insolvent to, well, actually, we've sourced new funding. We've been able to cram down creditors to a suitable level to be able to pay them an amount that will keep them at bay and be better than a solution if it was to go into insolvency, and we can try to return this company to profitability. But we can't just go straight into these types of engagements of where we say, okay, let's appoint a bankruptcy practitioner and let's go straight through this process. What you really want to be able to do is try to get that one step ahead and try to understand the situation in detail by getting in an A&M or a similar type of firm like ours to be able to show what is the contingency plan here. If we have a distressed business, a highly distressed business, let's not just let the courts decide what's going to happen. Let's not just wait and hope one creditor will or will not do something. Let's get experts that focus solely on this type of work to understand and show us what our contingency plans are. Because in a lot of cases, there's a number of leverage points that are available to professionals and to the company to ensure that when we look at the situation, we're identifying, okay, what's the worst case scenario of where we are? Do we need to be heading straight to a bankruptcy with no distribution to creditors, whatever it is? Is there a managed wind down we can put into place? Is there a carve out of certain profitable businesses that we can manage and coordinate to ensure a higher return to creditors? Or is there an outright FRP that we can enter into here with certain investors, lenders, whatever it may be, to ensure that we can actually turn this business around and bring this back out onto the outside of it, of a business that is actually running? And it's something that, in all honesty, the Kingdom's done a lot better than other regions around here for its mainland insolvency law, because we're seeing more and more FRPs being entered into in the Kingdom than any other region around here. And the reason for that is that creditors, stakeholders, everyone is identifying that I get a better return if this business continues to trade. Instead of me trying to sell all the assets on the balance sheet that may actually be overstated and their force value may be significantly lower, we can turn this business around, trade it for an unknown amount of years, and be able to pay out a distribution to creditors that is better than if it was going into liquidation and being wound down. Now, what all of this means, sorry, Paul?
Just an FRP. You use the expression FRP rather than me interrupt.
Sure. Well, we're actually coming to the end of it here anyway. So
no, what I'm saying is you use the expression FRP. People may not all know what it is.
Well, yeah. So the FRP is effectively the bankruptcy, the Kingdom's bankruptcy version of a restructuring plan that can be put forward and can give creditors the ability to gain a better return than a bankruptcy, but also see the company be able to trade through its problems and struggles that it may have. But where we were coming to in all of this is that we've looked at what we are experiencing as a company, the stress, the heightened levels of unable to pay their debts, the claims that are coming through, the covenant breaches. We've looked at what we need to consider and what we're worried about during that time, directors' duties, the insolvent trading claims, preferential payments, related party transactions, everything that's occurring in that banner. And then we've been able to show, yes, there's a solution that's here. Sometimes it is to enter straight into bankruptcy and the business just needs to be wound down because there may not be a life within it. But in a lot of cases, and the future that we're seeing within the kingdom and the region now, is to be able to enter into a restructuring process, or an FRP, as Paul would like to make sure we mention. But that's all for me. I'll hand over to Paul to give a nice sort of summary and bring together what we've been discussing.
No, look, thank you, Guy. And what I was trying to say was FRP stands for Financial Restructuring Plan. But yeah, look, so we've given you a canter through all of the stages. I think one thing to mention, although you know, and Guy's alluded to it, although you know, we prefer to absolutely avoid businesses going through an insolvency process. They can be a tool in the right circumstances, but by this point, you know, the shareholder wealth has been largely diminished. So look, I think many thanks for giving us the opportunity to kind of talk through at a reasonable level, give a few examples of how we see the world. We've talked through with Guy insolvency and you know, and the you know, the in emphasizing that the kingdom has one of the best new insolvency bankruptcy regimes that's been introduced in recent years, and that's a huge credit to the kingdom. We've talked through distress, which is the last stage before insolvency, where you're running out of options, and we've talked through stress, and we've talked through our little invention of pre-stress, which is really where you know, it's either before you're actually stressed, or in reality it's businesses that really are underlying stressed or distressed, but they're being drip fed and probably should be taking action much sooner. And I think the one thing that I'd follow on for again is, as Cam's tried to emphasize, and indeed I do, you know, restructuring shouldn't be seen as a bad thing or a bad word. It really is a reinvention and a way to stay fresh, and a way to avoid finding yourself on that decline curve. So with that, you know, thank you very much. Thank you again very much to Majid Karoub, and you know, any questions?
Yes, actually, we have two questions. I would like to throw them to the panel, and you, Paul, decide who will take each of the two questions. The first question is, why should companies start considering transformation plan before it is in distress? And the second question regarding the biggest challenges faced by companies when trying to implement a turnaround plan in-house. I will let you decide which one of the panel will tackle each of the questions.
Okay. I'll let Cam take the second one, so I'll give him time to prepare, and I'll take the first one. So I think the question was why should a company start dealing with a transformation plan, or a restructuring, as we would call it, before it finds itself in stress or distress? And there are a huge number of reasons for that. Just purely based upon the usual market cycle and business cycle, businesses go, you know, markets go through changes where they reach a peak and eventually they'll change and they'll drop off. Businesses have to reinvent themselves. You look at the number of times Apple has reinvented itself, and you know, it's you know, going from its you know, first desktop computer through to, you know, its latest iPhones. The number of reinventions, had it still just been manufacturing those desktop computers, it would have gone out of business years and years ago. It never found itself, to my knowledge, in a liquidity crunch or a stressed or distressed position, but it is constantly restructured in a good way. And so that's, if you like, the market view of it before you even start thinking about stress or distress. The other major reason is that if you find yourself in stress or distress, you are automatically getting to the point where you are in less control of your own destiny, by which we mean you're starting to have to fight fires. You're starting to have to deal with crises because you can't get parts, or because a particular supplier is saying, well, you've got to pay me before I give you anything, any of the supplies, or you're struggling to pay or even recruit employees. Finding yourself in a cash constrained position is not a good place to be, because you're less in control. And you're also in a position where you are now no longer able to devote so much cash resources, because you're running out of cash, on actually creating a plan to get yourself out of that difficult position. So for instance, if the way out of the decline is to spend, let's say, for the sake of argument, 100 million riyals on a new capex project, and you've just wasted you're down to your last 5 million, whatever it may be, you've wasted the opportunity to reinvent the business in such a way that it can come out of the other side. And who's going to lend you that at this stage? So automatically you're now going cap in hand to somebody else to help you out of trouble. So it's about the market. The market is always changing, so change is a constant. So restructure before you have to, and it's about doing so when you have time and cash to do so before you find yourself fighting fires. Anything anybody wants to add on that from our panel before I hand over to the question 2? Okay.
Sorry, Paul, I just have one point to add, and that's the point that you made earlier, which is the earlier you take action, the more options and time you have, right? The higher the probability of survival. So if you take action when you're in pre-stress, you have a much higher chance of survival. Same thing in stress, rather than wait until you're in distress or insolvent.
Yeah, absolutely. No, great point. And quite often businesses don't realize they're as stressed as they really are, particularly from a market perspective and the speed of decline.
Absolutely. And this goes back to the point that you made, Paul, on the demise curve, which is because the shareholders keep dripping money into the company, it looks as if it's financially healthy, but in reality, it might be distressed or even almost insolvent.
Yes, but if you please, I would like just to add up one thing, that that's the job of the directors or of the legal advisors that give that kind of information. Because like you say, when we are in a distress situation, or when we are stressed, we're out of, we just want to get out and we have no idea until we find ourselves in insolvency and we're going bankruptcy and all the accounts are closed and everything is closed upon each other. So what you are explaining today is very, very clear. And it helps the legal advisors to really understand that there are many steps that have to be followed before we tell a person that you are out of the market, you are dead as anything to do with business or the corporate, So it's very clear and it's very nice. Thank you.
And that's a very good point that you make, because you need to work with your lawyers as well to understand that you are performing your director's duties as well. So it is very important to work with your legal advisors, work with your financial advisors, really understand your duties whenever you're in distress or insolvency.
Yeah, great.
Perfect. So, and then the next question was, what is the biggest challenge on carrying out a transformation in-house? And I was going to let Cam take this one.
Oh, I love this question. So thank you for asking it. I think, let me frame my answer by explaining what I see a turnaround plan to be. So there is no one size fits all sort of turnaround plan, and each plan will typically be developed on the back of, as Sophia was mentioning earlier, some form of diagnostic. So some sort of hard analysis And so it's not just numbers. It's not just sort of sitting in a room crunching numbers. It's deep conversations all across a business, and working with different parts of the business, all the way from operations to finance to legal to HR. So the process is quite broad-reaching to develop this plan, and this plan can include a real mix of things, which depends on the business itself. So it could be a change in the organization structure. It could be a real aggressive reduction in the overhead base. It could be a financial restructuring. So I've seen a case recently where we've got a reasonably strong business that has been going through a little bit of a difficult period, but it had agreed 3 years ago quite an aggressive amortization program of its debt. So it's left itself in a position where it's struggling from a liquidity perspective because its financial structure, its capital structure was inappropriate. So a financial restructuring may be part of a turnaround plan. It could involve a strategic pivot or change or reset within the business. It could also involve sort of just that nuts and bolts critical process redesign. So there are lots of different elements to a turnaround plan. Now, you can be given a turnaround plan by a wonderful consultant, and then it sits there and it gathers dust on a desk, and people say, oh yeah, I'm the in-house team, I know how to implement this. Now, I wish I had $1 for every time someone in the kingdom had said, I've got a transformation plan, I've got a turnaround plan, but nothing's happened. So why is that? And I think that there are a range of different reasons. One, I think a lot of times you find management are good at business as usual. You know, we've got on a current case just now, we've got this CEO is a lovely guy. He knows his business inside out. But if you talk to him about really granular cash precious situations, he genuinely struggles to deal with it because he's a business as usual guy. He's focused on his customers and things like that. So one, it's that management. And are they just used to operating as business as usual, or are they a bit more pragmatic? Time. I mean, businesses that are having a bit of trouble, if you then go and say to the head of operations, the head of finance, the CEO, oh, by the way, guys, you've got to now lead a bunch of turnaround work streams, they struggle for time. They're too busy putting out fires and running their own business, running their own parts of the business. So what happens is the momentum around these plans tends to dissipate very quickly. I touched on management, also skill set. You know, you do need to be very pragmatic. You do need to be that sort of 80-20 mindset, and quite hands-on. So not all management teams have these sorts of characteristics. Accountability is a great one. When a turnaround plan is devised, it's not always clear who's responsible for delivering certain aspects of that plan or that turnaround. I use turnaround and transformation interchangeably. They're pretty much the same thing. One just feels a bit softer than the other, but who's accountable for delivering this plan? And what you'll often find is that, again, I talked about dissipation. You know, if it's not clear who's responsible and who's going to be held accountable to deliver these different parts of a plan, then it doesn't happen. Another is culture. Culturally, businesses don't like change. Yeah, there is a real, when you're trying to implement a change within your organization, and that's what a turnaround or a transformation is, there's a real mental or a paradigm shift to be more commercial, ask hard questions. Again, a case we're dealing with at the moment, they're just not used to going back to their customer and asking hard questions and saying, hey, we've got a contract. It says this, this, and this, and you've done that. And we're just accepting it as hurting our business. This can't go on. So you have to start to address cultural challenges within a business, and that's difficult. Communications is another real key one. If you're, for example, making changes to the organization structure, how those changes are delivered and the communications around those changes are very important, because everyone likes to gossip, right? Everyone likes to talk. So it's very important that, and I think that if you're an in-house management team, you might not know this. You might not know how a turnaround or a transformation can get off track if the messaging around it is not really tightly controlled. Another thing I think is really, and my last 2 points, and then I'll finish. But one is around sort of financial data and using that data to build a bit of an independent fact base. Because what you find is that ultimately financial information or management information, one of its key purposes is to give the management team the right quality information to make sound decisions. So if that information is not really robust, then management are making decisions built on sand. And then what you'll have is down the track, oh well, we didn't know this was wrong. So if the in-house team has not had the time or the opportunity to develop a really robust fact base to anchor all of the different turnaround plans or initiatives onto, then what you find again is that things stutter, dissipate, and start to fail. So a turnaround or a transformation is an ever evolving and delicate, almost a creature that has to be nurtured. So it's very exciting, but it's really tough to do if you've not done it before or if you don't have the time. But I hope that answers the question. So thank you for that one.
I'm just going to follow up with one reinforcing comment on that. And I think it's to say that you won't believe the number of times where we've said we'll do it in this period. We'll do it within, I don't know, 12 weeks. We're going to make these changes. Management, don't worry, we don't need you. We'll do it ourselves. 3 months later, 6 months later, we get a knock on the door. Yeah, we didn't achieve it. We're now kind of much more cash constrained than we were. So the ability to do it fast is not and implement fast is not something that should be taken for granted. It's actually quite a specialized skill set for all of the reasons that Cam describes. So yeah, look, any more questions?
Thank you so much. These are the questions that we have, and I can say that it has been tremendous listening and watching this forum regarding the family business and its important topic. Thank you, Paul, Cam, Guy, and Sophia, and also many thanks to the team of Dr. Majid Garoub Law Firm. With that, we wish you all a very pleasant night and good night, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for having us, and we hope that this has helped. Thank you.
Thank you.